Manifesto, Part 2, that'll be Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3 on Socialist and Communist literature, and Chapter 4, this one's a mouthful, the position of communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. So before I want to jump into those parts, I just want to do a brief review of Part 1 with Chapters 1 and 2 that Tyler so gloriously presented us last week. So I'm just going to jump into some quick points about that. First being a very bright red screen. Uh-oh. There we go. So, revisiting Part 1. Once again, it was published in 1848, 3 weeks before the French Revolution of February 24th. In the preface, Engels states that the Manifesto was published as the platform of the Communist League, a working men's association. Marx and Engels were commissioned to prepare for publication a complete theoretical and practical party program. Drawn up in German in January 1848, the manuscript was sent to the printer in London a few weeks later, before the French Revolution of February 24th. And then one interesting detail that I just wanted to highlight real quick, because we're talking about different forms of socialism and what have you. The manifesto was titled Communist rather than Socialist because, as Engels explained, the word socialist was associated with the Utopians on the one hand, and on the other with the most, quote, multifarious social quacks who by all manner of tinkering profess to redress without any danger to capital and profit all sorts of social grievances, which I love. And therefore, this publication, quote, whatever portion of the working class had become convinced of the insufficiency of mere political revolutions and had proclaimed the necessity of a total social change, called itself communist. So, as we know, just to close that part out, it is the most concise statement and the most important single document of Marxism, where all revolutionary socialism has been inspired. Let's see. I'm trying to go to the next slide, and it's not allowing me to. Oh my God. Hold on, guys. Sorry about that.
I can edit this out. Don't worry about it.
Perfect. For some reason, yeah, it's not letting me. There we go. We can make that happen. All right. So Tyler, of course, covered this as well. The idea of the specter that is haunting Europe. The specter of communism. So the manifesto kind of made clear and distinguished their goals and aims, their theories and practices to expose this specter, right, as the fairy tale that it actually was. And that's something they mentioned in the manifesto as well. So, of course, that's something we're still attempting to do today. You know, when we're talking about anti-communist indoctrination, as we, from the time we're children up and through adulthood. But the powerful point here is that the power of communism is seen as a viable threat to these world powers. They need to create a monster, therefore we need to create a monster as well. And this kind of supports the statement that communists must be present and open in their revolutionary struggles. So slide 3 here, we're just again revisiting very briefly the bourgeoisie and the proletarians with the all-around kind of quote here, all history of hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Essentially, this speaks to the evolution and the development and growth of the power in the epoch of the bourgeoisie to the date of the publication when there was such a, quote, gigantic means of production and exchange. It is like the sorcerer who's no longer able to control the powers of the netherworld. This results in the provision of tools for the proletariat and equals too much commerce, industry, subsistence, and civilization. Further, it necessitates the need to conquer other economies. Think imperialism and further exploitation of these old ones. So the bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and with them, full relations of society. And so the second one, Proletarians and Communists. Essentially, the immediate aim, this is the quote, the immediate aim of the communists is the same as that of all other proletarian parties. Formation of the proletariat into a class, overthrow of the bourgeois supremacy, conquest of political power by the proletariat. And we know also that one of the ideals is in international solidarity. I won't go through all those quotes there because we've got a lot to cover. And of course, we know the 10 measures of the Communist Party in those ideals. So we're talking abolition of property, rents of land to public purposes, heavy graduated income tax, abolition of right of inheritance, confiscation of property from immigrants and rebels, credit centralization to national bank with state capital, centralization of communication and transport. Factories and instruments of production are owned by the state. There's a cultivation and renewal of wastelands and improvement of the environment as a whole. There's an obligation of all to work, industrial armies, especially in agriculture. Those agriculture and manufacturing are combined. We find the abolition of town versus country and an equitable distribution of people across land. Lastly, free education and abolition of factory labor for children. There is traditional education and industrial production, vocational education and training, more or less. So, to wrap that piece up, just so that we remember what's going on, in place of the old bourgeois society with its classes and class antagonisms, we shall have an association in which the free development of each is the condition for the free development of all. And I want to say thank you again to Tyler for his magnificent presentation last week and the opportunity to just kind of revisit that real quick. So in parts 3 and 4, once again, we know that the chapters are socialist and communist literature, and then the communists and pretty much versus the opposition parties. Let's see. So we're going to start with the socialist and communist literature. Essentially, that analyzes the varieties, differences, and it critiques the different forms of socialisms. The positions of the communists in comparison to these ideas discussed from the opposition parties are going to be described in a few slides for chapter 4. So first will be reactionary socialism that has 4 categories below. Then conservative or bourgeois socialism, and lastly, critical utopian socialism and communism. So reactionary socialism, just to kind of give kind of a brief idea, it is anti-revolutionary in a different camps of these types of socialism. You'll have goals to improve societal and political structures. There will be a preservation of one's position in social and economic hierarchies against the bourgeois class, but for one's own advancement, security, or return to prior class conditions and stratifications. That'll be primarily in feudal socialism. In addition to some abstract theory, which we'll find in the German or true socialism. So those 3 are described under there. And we'll begin with feudal socialism. Actually, I do want to state that instead of focusing super highly on the publication and writings of these individual parties, I've kind of examined further the concepts that were put forth by the groups. And so the primary information in the writing were more or less the group's perspective as a whole, because it was more discussed in that way, I believe. So in each slide, I'll briefly kind of mention the literary part of it, and the overall philosophy and the reactivity that we find within that struggle against the bourgeoisie. So this feudal socialism basically, to me, feels like a bit of a temper tantrum. It's sort of a resentment of the loss of aristocratic power via the development of the modern bourgeois society. And the lit basically states that feudal socialists, they were French and English aristocrats, published pamphlets having had their power taken, and they were basically incapable of any sort of revolution. And they were frightened by the prospect of a true proletarian revolution. So they failed to recognize that the, quote, modern bourgeoisie society is the necessary offspring of their own form of society, end quote. Actually, I'm going to skip the quote, end quote, because we got 2 more there. The aristocracy took their revenge by singing lampoons on their new master and whispering in his ears sinister prophecies of coming catastrophe. So that would be kind of in the publication of their documents, and kind of goes with this first point here. I don't know if you can see the lovely guiding arrows there, but again, in the first point there, we have a resentment of the loss of aristocratic power. So in that literature, once again, there's a statement that it is, quote, half lamentation, half lampoon, half echo of the past, half menace of the future, at times by its bitter, witty, and incisive criticism, striking the bourgeoisie to the very heart's core, which I think is a pretty solid compliment. But of course, it is followed with the critique that it is always ludicrous in its effects through total incapacity to comprehend the march of modern history. So because they're unable to surrender to the loss of the feudal systems and aristocratic hierarchies, again, they're sort of just throwing an ineffective temper tantrum. So they're not against the existence of a proletariat, right? Because they had their own feudal system with their own hierarchies and rankings. But they're pissed about the loss of power, and they become, once again, not pissed off or afraid about the existence of workers, but rather revolutionary workers. And that's sort of the kicker there. So for the second one, basically, I would say that there's a quote that states, "So little do they conceal the reactionary character of their criticism that their chief accusation against the bourgeoisie amounts to this, that under the bourgeois regime, a class is being developed which is destined to cut up root and branch the old order of society." And lastly, for part 3 there, what they upbraid the bourgeoisie with is not so much that it creates a proletariat as that it creates a revolutionary proletariat, which was simply already stated. And then I just kind of wanted to make mention of clerical socialism, as it was mentioned in the text. But they're basically talking about, Christian asceticism, and by all appearances, it would be beneficial and it would make them look good as good Christians to be altruistic in their behaviors and to care about other people. So Marx states that it does go hand in hand, and that Christian socialism is but the holy water with which the priest consecrates the heart burnings of the aristocrat, which I thought was pretty solid. So on to petty bourgeoisie socialism, bourgeois socialism. I'm a little nervous. I don't know if anybody else likes the zombie thing, but I was kind of into it, because the basic point of this, that it all comes down to, is that there is a fear of falling into the proletariat class by the petty bourgeoisie there. So the literature essentially focused on their writings and sided with the proletariat class due to the reality that the majority of the population in places like France was of that class. So they put forth their writings from the standpoint of the intermediate class in their, quote, criticism of the bourgeois regime, the standard of the peasant and petty bourgeois, end quote. So it's a pretty simple, straightforward, camp of thinking in that one. So what is fascinating about this is that they did have a good analysis of some of these inherent flaws of capitalisms and the issues therein. And I'll just go ahead and read this, that it proved incontrovertibly that the disastrous effects of machinery and division of labor, the concentration of capital and land in a few hands, overproduction and crises, it pointed out the inevitable ruin of the petty bourgeois and peasant, the misery of the proletariat, the anarchy in production, the crying inequalities in the distribution of wealth, the industrial war of extermination between nations, the disillusion of old moral bonds, of the old family relations, and the old nationalities. So despite these kind of legitimate recognitions of the destruction of the bourgeois class and capitalism, there are critiques that follow. And I would say that would be quoted as this form of socialism aspires either to restoring the old means of production and of exchange, and with them the old property relations and the old society, or to cramping the modern means of production and of exchange within the framework of the old property by those means. And so that's kind of what makes it reactionary. So moving on to German or true socialism, I have those hands there as it felt like these guys were kind of reaching for something that would be applicable and relevant, yet that was not really possible. So essentially with their literature, it came down to the fact that it was simply irrelevant to the social conditions of Germany in relation to France, where they got those ideas, because the struggle against the bourgeois class had been continuing in France, whereas in Germany, they were kind of in the infancy of this struggle. So, quote, when these writings immigrated from France into Germany, French social conditions had not immigrated along with them and assumed a pure literary aspect. And I kind of shoved two together there. So you'll see here in the third point, just trying to follow along the lines here. So we have the translation and injection of German philosophies, kind of that overlay within the French perspectives within the French Revolution there. And that evolved into a focus on man separate from class conditions. And this is described in the quote stating that the French socialist and communist literature was thus completely emasculated. And since it ceased in the hands of the German to express the struggle of one class with the other, he felt conscious of having overcome, quote, French one-sidedness, end quote, and of representing not true requirements, but the requirements of truth, not the interests of the proletariat, but the interests of human nature, of man in general, who belongs to no class, has no reality, who exists only in the misty realm of philosophical fantasy. And interestingly enough, they have evolved in such a way that they ended up in direct opposition to the, quote, brutally destructive tendency of communism. So that was a pretty interesting little development there. Now to jump into the next section, so we just talked about kind of the more reactive socialism, reactionary socialism. So now section 2 is just kind of talking exclusively about conservative or bourgeois socialism. And this feels pretty relevant to our times, I would say. And it is certainly one of the aspects more infuriating of liberalism in particular, I would say, even though that we wouldn't consider that socialism unless we're talking about democratic socialists. So liberalism seems to be a representation, and the behaviors are relevant, I would say. They're essentially band-aids on societal problems that hide the utter terrorism that is capitalism. So it's just kind of like that continuation of the brainwashing of the working class against consciousness and uprising against the bourgeoisie and the social conditions directly due to capitalism. And I think about this summer and kind of the tampering down of the uprising in Denver. You think about State Bill 217, we're talking body cameras and chokeholds and, all of that stuff. So essentially, there's no real desire to discard or create any meaningful change, but rather kind of have these thinly veiled efforts at, providing people what they need through a welfare state and through reformism. So another quote, of course. To this section belong economists, philanthropists, humanitarians, improvers of the condition of the working class, organizers of charity, members of society for the prevention of cruelty to animals, temperance fanatics, hole and corner reformers of every imaginable kind. This form of socialism has, moreover, been worked out into complete systems. And see, once again, I would find that this is completely relatable and relevant to today. And one of the reasons that the second half of the manifesto is not discussed as much is that there's this belief that because it's about some of this literature, it's no longer, relevant to today's social climate, I guess you could say. But this one in particular, I think, is very, very important to examine. at the end, it states that, quote, free trade is for the benefit of the working class. Protective duties for the benefit of the working class. This is the last word and the only seriously meant word of bourgeois socialism, end quote. I don't know if anyone's seen Persepolis, but it is an excellent movie. I would highly recommend. So lastly, we're talking about critical utopian socialism and communism. Sort of a belief in a peaceful society where social harmony eliminates class antagonism. So I believe it to be pacifist and abstract, fanciful, and in this case, in these times, it was unrealized conditionally. So we find again this mention of a fantastical belief in a new society, improved social conditions for all to, quote, pave the way for the new social gospel, end quote. Again, it was the conditions were undeveloped for class antagonism at this point because there was not much of a direct history behind what was going on. It was sort of a rising matter. So to support that, we have the quotes stating, since the development of class antagonism keeps even pace with the development of industry, the economic situation as they find it does not as yet offer to them material conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. They therefore search after new social science, after new social laws that are to create those conditions, i.e. utopian. So once again, just to kind of revisit that, it was developed early on during the overthrow of the feudal society. So there are three particular failures in that, and that there was a lack of a developed state of the proletariat. There was a lack of fully realized economic conditions that were to be brought about by the bourgeois system, and a lack of, again, just kind of backing up these previous 2 points, a lack of historical initiative or independent political movement. And of course, they were against rising class antagonisms in seeking a social utopia. So on this fourth point here, it's stated that it was developed in the, quote, early attempts of the proletariat to attain its own ends when feudal society was being overthrown, end quote. The proletarian was in an undeveloped state, and the, quote, absence of the economic conditions for its emancipation, conditions that had yet to be produced, end quote, could only come about with the full realization of, quote, impending bourgeois epoch alone, end quote. That was mentioned earlier. Also, quote, the founders of these systems see indeed the class antagonisms as well as the action of the decomposing elements in the prevailing form of society. But the proletariat, as yet in its infancy, offers to them the spectacle of a class without any historical initiative or any independent political movement, as that last point shows there. And once again, it was against the rising class antagonisms that were coming about. So to further that statement, quote, although the originators of these systems were in many respects revolutionary, their disciples have in every case formed mere reactionary sects. They hold fast by their original views of their masters in opposition to the progressive historical development of the proletariat. They therefore endeavor to deaden the class struggle and to reconcile the class antagonisms. And that's a picture of a cult. Also, I just like this graphic, always have. I don't think it's super relevant to the chapter, but I'm not too worried about it. And the last chapter here is the position of the communists in relation to the various existing opposition parties. So this is basically kind of revisiting the goals and perspective of the Communist Party, of the theories of Lenin and Marx, or excuse me, Engels and Marx. And so just to kind of wrap up all of that, essentially that the previous chapter talked about all the ways in which the Communist Party is different from these other socialist parties, the opposition parties. And the arguments are that, you know, it is the fight for the immediate and future aims of the working class with support of all revolutionary movements internationally in varying relevant alliances and united solidarity. So in that chapter, it's talking about the different actions of communists throughout Europe We talk about Switzerland supporting radicals. In Poland, they're supporting the party that insists on an agrarian revolution for emancipation, talking about what they do in Germany. And they mention that they never cease for a single instant to instill into the working class the clearest possible recognition of the hostile antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat. And this is specific to Germany, in order that the German workers may straightway use, as so many weapons against the bourgeoisie, the social and political conditions that the bourgeoisie must necessarily introduce along with its supremacy. And in order that after the fall of the reactionary classes in Germany, the fight against the bourgeoisie itself may immediately begin. So flowing into that, at the time, the Communist Party was essentially focusing most on the revolutionary climate in Germany, because it was essentially stating that they were on their way to a bourgeois revolution, which will be the prelude to an immediately following proletarian revolution. So that's why there was a heavy focus on the German matters as well. But these last couple of pages really tie together the philosophies once more of the Communist Party, in stating that the communists disdain to conceal their views and aims. They openly declare that their ends can be attained only by the forcible overthrow of all existing social conditions. We also know, when we were talking earlier about that, revisits chapter 2 that Tyler presented on, as far as the proletariat and the communists, in those points of developing the class of the proletariat, the overthrow of the bourgeois, et cetera, et cetera. So that kind of revisits and reinforces that point. Communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things. That is a very important point as well. So, of course, these last classics here: let the ruling class tremble at a communist revolution. The proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries, unite.